Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 116 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today's guest is Michael Honegger. Michael is a professional photographer and author. He spent much of his youth growing up in West Germany in the 1960s. His father was an officer with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Michael knew almost nothing of his father's career at the time, but there were a lot of clues that he was involved in some very important and very secretive work. Years later, Michael embarked on a quest to learn more about his father's work and put it into the larger context of the Cold War. I invited Michael onto the podcast to discuss his new book, The Need to Know. It's a collection of stories, records, and photos, both from his own family's years in West Germany, the archives of the East German Stasi, and from the Berlin Spy Museum, among other places. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history, just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at krashiki.com. Kruss himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at krashiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Michael, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Justin. Thank you.
Certainly, I appreciate the opportunity. So I've had the sons and daughters of several intelligence professionals and spies on the podcast over the past couple of years, and it's always amazing to me how difficult it can be for them to really know their own parents and how they kept, such a large portion of their lives completely hidden for years or even for decades. And I think that one thing that kind of separates you from a lot of my previous guests is that your father's work was right there in your hometown in many ways. So can you tell me what it was that led you to kind of pursue this project in the first place?
I'd be happy to. It was actually very serendipitous, the whole manner in which the project got started. I was attending a photo workshop in Maine, and I was being interviewed by one of the participants in the workshop. And she asked about my family background, so she had to introduce me to the whole group. And I mentioned my father was a spy during the Cold War. Well, when she went in to introduce me to the group, that's what she focused on. And I began to realize at that point and everyone was quite interested in hearing more, including the facilitator of the workshop. She said, "What a great idea for a photo project." Well, I was in between photo projects and looking for something to delve into, and I thought I agreed with her and thought this would be interesting, but I needed to begin a process of gathering more information. But I left there on a high, basically, thinking, this would be interesting not only from a historical point of view, but to answer some of the questions I always had, if possible, because my father had passed away and I no longer had him as a resource. Also, our family didn't know. I asked my mother after this workshop, who is still alive, whether she remembered much of the period. And she said that his work was always segmented. He never shared details. She knew what he did, but the details were never divulged.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a regular, a totally expected component of that kind of work. But it's the unfortunate side effect of it is that it kind of keeps children from really getting to know what, kind of drove their parents to do what they did. And, it probably had unexpected impacts on the course of all of your lives, as his career took him to different places and the stresses of the job and that kind of thing, I would have to imagine. So, how did you go about piecing the story together since, like you said, your father had already passed?
Well, fortunately, I did have a number of conversations with him when he was still alive. The other element in this entire episode really is that I should mention that he was fluent, he was bilingual in German, which our family is originally from Switzerland, and he was raised speaking fluent German, which made a big difference in terms of his job with the Air Force as a special agent. And it was that if you will, that led him into some of the situations that I later discovered. And in terms of piecing the story together, I began. The first thing I did when after I left this workshop was I started doing letters to, for example, a Freedom of Information Act request to the Air Force to see if they had any records of any of the cases he worked on. That turned up nothing, which didn't surprise me. But I thought after 60 years that there might be something that was extant. I also discovered that the Stasi records, the East German secret police records, had been divulged to the public, and I wrote to them. There was a mechanism online for contacting them, and you fill out a form, and I told them all the details, and I did hear back from them rather promptly, and they said that any international records of the Stasi were the first things destroyed when the regime collapsed. And they were most efficient in destroying the international records. And after doing further research on the Stasi, I realized that they had a very distinct interest in keeping those records or destroying those records because they still had active agents in West Germany. So after all of that, I also began to, I was a little frustrated when I got the response that they didn't have anything because those records had been destroyed. So I decided I had to go to Berlin. I found out there was the German Spy Museum had opened fairly recently. I thought, well, maybe I'll contact someone there. And I got in touch with the curator of their archives and asked him if I could photograph some of the tools of the spy trade that they had in their archives. And he was very responsive and very kind. And we set a date in February of 2020. And I flew to Berlin and had a whole day at the German Spy Museum, which I highly recommend to anyone interested in espionage. It's very interactive, very interesting exhibits. I spent most of the day photographing these tools of the trade, many of which are in the book as inserts, so you can see some of the both U.S. or Allied tools that were used. I'm talking about bugs. I'm talking about the Minox camera is the typical one, but there were some pretty unusual elements in their archives. One of which, the most interesting, I thought, was a watering can kept in the bottom had a camera, and it was used by the Stasi at funerals of dissidents. And they would have a caretaker at the grave next to the grave where the dissident was being buried. and they would photograph anyone coming as a mourner to the grave site. They were automatically suspected of being fellow dissidents. I thought it was I thought it was pretty insidious, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it certainly is, but it was, effective and efficient as well. Especially if you assume the worst about everybody around you, I guess you'll never be surprised or disappointed by their
exactly,
actions.
exactly.
So, yeah, that was a fascinating organization in all the worst possible ways. But looked at it from their perspective, that is an incredibly advantageous thing to do, to figure out who is in this person's family and associated network, and what were their true feelings about him, that sort of thing. It's
Oh,
very
absolutely.
advantageous to do it. But you think, what kind of person thinks that up, and
Exactly.
how do they sleep at night?
Exactly. Well, there were many things that the Stasi did in my research that were real jaw droppers as far as I was concerned. And I just thought that one summarized it rather neatly. So,
Yeah, yeah, certainly they were a very, I don't know how to say this neutrally, but they were an impressive organization in many ways.
no, they were from the point of view of espionage, they were quite efficient. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
No doubt about it. So you were kind of dead ended in many ways right off the bat with learning more about your father. I am curious. Did the Air Force, did they simply not respond, or did they say that they had nothing in connection with your father's work?
No, they did respond in all fairness, but it was one of these bureaucratic, sorry, there's no records that
Yeah.
conform to your request. So,
Okay. Yeah, that is unfortunate,
yeah,
but perfectly valid point. Like, what could possibly be worth keeping secret after 60
right.
years? Very little, I
Very
would
little.
imagine.
Yeah.
Honestly. Yeah. Unfortunate. So, how did you start to piece this together? Was it mostly like from talking to your mother? Did you locate any of his former coworkers or anything like that?
Well, at this point, most of his coworkers, I would imagine, had also passed away. But I did talk to the family, and I got all sorts of interesting tidbits from my sister, my mother, and what I decided to do was, since I didn't have any concrete information, we had some very dear German friends from our time, since my father and mother both spoke German, and we children also learned German. But most of their friends were German, and a few of them are still alive. And I did make a trip to Germany uh, right after COVID ended. That's another completely bizarre story, but in doing research, I collected information on all of the border crossing or border museums, which are now museums, but at, at one point they were actually points of crossing into
Hmm.
East Germany. And I decided I wanted to drive to as many of those that I could get that were near Kassel, where we were stationed and posted. And I sort of plotted out which museums looked the most interesting. I drove to Germany, or I flew up and then got a car for about 10 days. And I went back to Kassel, stayed with some old German friends of the family. That one family member, the Luca family, was one family I visited, and all of the generations that followed, and they had been very close friends of my father and mother. And in fact, Herr Luca, this is a kind of interesting sidelight. He owned a toy store in the small town where we lived in Kassel, a little village. And he owned a toy store, and I was, a 10-year-old kid who was enthralled with his toy store. And my father joined me one day in going into the toy store, and they started up a friendship that lasted the rest of their lives, actually, a very close bond. It wasn't until I started doing research and went on this trip back to Germany that I discovered that Herr Luca had been born in East Germany and had defected. And I didn't know that at the time when I was a child. And it made things suddenly, and my mother mentioned this also, that when I found this out, we began to it raised all sorts of questions because my father and Herr Luca, he got my father to join a handball team that was a German handball team, and they played, weekly in handball season. And my father, hung out with all of this team, and we began to wonder if Herr Luca, and this is all in retrospect, began to wonder if he had been helping my father recruit agents, recruit, sources, because there were so many questions raised when we found out where he actually came from and that he had defected. And my mother said she was not aware of it until much later. So
Hmm.
it was one of those quirky things.
Yeah, yeah, I can see how that would raise a lot of questions, and that's the story here. So many times is that we end up with more questions than answers, and that it's so much time has passed that there's really no way to verify it. But I mean, your father sounds like he was a very capable guy, and he would certainly have had the lay of the land around him and his, nearby contacts. What advantages can they provide, or what vulnerabilities do they represent, or something like that. So I can certainly see why that would have that Herr Luca would have been of interest to him and his organization as well.
Absolutely. And it was interesting because none of the other agents in his office, of course, most of them didn't speak German, but he spent so much time with them that it just leads us to suspect. And it's kind of an interesting speculation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and quite what you said as well about how they met and how they saw each other. Those are perfectly natural
Yeah,
things that can be explained away by somebody else, but perfect opportunity to pass information both ways.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, what could you suspect about a guy, taking his son into a toy store and the son walks out a few minutes later with a new toy, and there's nothing to that really.
Right. And Lord knows I spent a lot of time in that toy store.
Wow. So it must have worked out for all three of you then in that case,
Exactly.
sounds like. Wow. Good, good, good. So were there some other things like in retrospect that you recall now that, with 2020 hindsight that like, wow, that I wonder if that was some sort of work thing for my dad as well.
There were quite a few instances where either it was obvious or you kind of suspected. For example, we would go every often on a Sunday we would go for a drive. We would leave Kassel and go out into the country and find a small village. And it was, in retrospect, these villages always seemed to be close to the border. And we went to one called Hanmünden, which was very close to the border. And my father would, there were restaurants, and the Sunday outing was usually to go to a restaurant in the afternoon and with German friends or not, just the family. And we would have a nice lunch and then go for a hike or a walk in the woods or whatever. Dad would disappear often before lunch.
Hmm.
He'd say, "Go in, get a table. I'll be with you in 20 minutes," or something like that. And my mom would lead us all in. Sure enough, a half hour later, he would join us. Well, at the time, I just thought I didn't know what he was doing, and nobody did. In retrospect, I imagine he was, meeting contact because we were so close to the border that it made sense. There was another instance. This was in Wiesbaden, actually, where I woke up one night. I had gone to bed, and then I woke up. There was some noise that awakened me, and I went into the living room, and there was a man talking to my father, who I had never seen before, and they were speaking German. And my father just said, "Go back to bed," and didn't introduce me or anything, which was not unusual in that kind of circumstance. And I woke up the next morning, came out, and I realized the man had slept on our couch and then was gone the next morning. There was just a blanket or whatever, and he was gone. And I asked my father, who was that? And he said, "You have the need to know," which was the question his response to any question about what he was doing work-wise. Do you have the need to know? And that meant just don't talk about it anymore. Change the subject.
Ooh.
And we all were very well trained in do you have the need to know? And hence the name
Oh
of the
my God.
book, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. So, and that kind of makes me wonder, speculate really, like if he wanted to keep his family so separate from some things, was this like an absolutely extraordinary circumstance? You know what I mean? That couldn't possibly wait because if he, his family's sleeping upstairs, I would assume he would normally want to avoid this kind of thing. So what was it that was so time sensitive, so urgent that he would, potentially allow you to see what you did see? You know what I mean?
No, it was very unusual. It was the only time it ever happened.
Yeah.
And the only other episode of a similar nature, again, it was late at night. I woke up, I come out, and my father is listening to a radio broadcast, and he's in the dining room table ta taking down notes very diligently, and it, I was listening to what they were saying on the radio, and it was all gibberish. And
Hmm.
I didn't think much about it until the next morning. I asked again, and he said, "Do you have the need to know?" And eventually, I figured out he was taking down some sort of code. And in going through his things, in researching the book, some of the family, his papers and that sort of thing, I found some of the coding sheets that he had been writing. I realized that, I tried to crack the code, but then I realized they were probably from one-time pads.
Hmm.
There was no way to really. The book designer actually asked me if I could tell her what it said, and I said, "I'm sorry, it's lost to history." So
Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to see what it's like to work in the shadows, negotiate under duress, gather intelligence for your action cells, and participate in simulated battle? You can at Centurion Combat Simulation's next big event. You will operate in the dangerous Latin American country of Copan, where you either fight for equality as part of a socialist insurgency or work to stabilize and promote democracy in a US backed war. In this fully immersive world, you have the ability to change the course of history by fighting for your side as a soldier or spy. Centurion Combat Simulations games run for 46 hours over 3 days with embedded role players to guide you and your teammates. Centurion's next event is at the Arena Training Center in Blakely, Georgia from December 8th through December 10th, 2023. Centurion Combat Simulations is owned and operated by retired U.S. Special Operations combat veterans. Don't miss out on this amazing opportunity to immerse yourself and test yourself. Enlist now at joincenturion.com. Well, I love seeing that in the book, honestly, and I appreciate you sending me ahead of time. That was such a cool thing to find in your father's effects there, and it kind of validates everything that you thought, honestly, at that point. Like he really was deeply involved in some very serious stuff.
no, there was no question. But again, when I asked him, it was always, "Do you have the need to know?" He never confessed anything, so we never heard anything uh, about what he did. So
That's unfortunate. So was he at least open about like I work for the Office of Special Investigations, or did he just say I'm a lieutenant in the Air Force or whatever it was at the time? Did he
oh,
tell you something completely different?
no, 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 no. First of all, he didn't wear a uniform, and none of the agents did. He just went in a suit and tie to work. But there was no question he that he worked for the Office of Special Investigations, that he was a special agent, and that was it. And I met all of his work colleagues. I'd go to the
Okay.
office, and he wasn't secretive about that. But you know, they socialized together also, the agents. And my parents were friends with most of the other agents and their families. And, there were picnics and that sort of thing. occasionally. And that was more in Wiesbaden. In Kassel, the group was much smaller, and we lived in a housing area that was actually on the German economy. There were 4 apartment buildings and a school, and that was about it in Kassel. So
Okay. So aside from those occasional interesting indicators about your dad's work, what was it like for you to grow up in that time period? Like, did the Cold War kind of loom over everything for everyone at that time, or did you feel like it was a very normal childhood then?
oh no, I think I felt that it was a normal childhood. I had maybe not so normal from the perspective of somebody growing up in America, but because we never went, we were there for 4 years from 1959 to 1963, and we never went back to the States during that time because in those days air travel wasn't quite the economic thing it is today. No, I grew up. I went to school in Air Force or military schools, not military in the sense of martial, but they were sponsored by the military, and my teachers were all Americans, other than the German teacher. I had the one unusual thing, I used to go into German bunkers that were near. Kassel was bombed heavily during the war because it was a major industrial site for the Nazis. I would play in bunkers and find all these Nazi relics and bullets, and for a kid of 10, I mean, this was heaven, And all my friends, we would go wandering and find these things, and but we did normal childhood things. One interesting thing in researching this, one of the childhood things we did was in the summer we would go swimming there was a base, and it had a swimming pool, and it was freezing cold water because in northern Germany you didn't get warm fuzzy water, but it was pretty darn cold. It wasn't until I was doing research that I found out there was a missile silo underneath that pool aimed towards the east, and
Wow.
it was a bit of a shock, I had to admit, when I discovered that, because we had obviously no idea that there was anything like that on the base. But
My gosh.
yeah,
So was the launch tube like directly underneath the pool, or was it like an entire tunneling complex, underneath there
to be honest,
that you were at?
just I couldn't tell you, but it did say there were multiple missiles when I found it,
Mm.
when I found the article about it. And
Okay.
so
Okay.
I couldn't tell you because I was totally unaware. And by the time I went back to the base. It was used by the Germans to house refugees during the refugee crisis of
Hmm.
2015, and it's now been turned over to a local community, and it's like an industrial area now. And
Oh, okay.
so,
Okay. I see. Wow. Well, it got my mind spinning immediately because digging out a large community swimming pool is perfect cover for, digging out a subterranean bunker or launch complex, something like that. You've already got a perfectly good reason for all the earth moving equipment, because I believe that those were very carefully guarded secrets where those actual missiles were during the Cold War. So it could very well have been directly underneath the pool.
oh, absolutely. And it
Amazing.
was, and it was. But, you asked about the Cold War, and I mean, yes, there were moments. The Cuban Missile Crisis was one moment when I remember everyone was very nervous. We were not far from what is called the Fulda Gap, which
Mm,
was
mhm.
the most vulnerable part of West Germany to Russian aggression, Russian tank maneuvering. There was a lot of tension around the missile crisis, and in fact, my mother was instructed. We were given C rations to put in our car, and my mother had to take the whole family without my father, take the whole family, and she had specific meeting points that she had to get to in the event that war broke out. And so that was pretty frightening, and I do remember it vividly. Although the more frightening thought was my mother wasn't very good with directions. She kept saying, "Well, we'll probably wind up in East Germany." so, so, but it never came to pass. We didn't actually have to implement the plan because
Hmm.
things calmed down shortly thereafter. But
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's very, very good for everybody that the Cold War never turned hot, because that would have been a terrible place for your family to be stuck at that time. Although your father was working to keep it cold, I'm sure.
right, exactly. So.
I'm curious, during that time period, could you, on the West German side, could you approach the border? Like, could you walk right up to the fence, away from the checkpoints, or was that like a no, 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 never get within, 500 meters of the fence line kind of thing?
Well, quite frankly, when I was that age, at that point, we were never even exposed to the border.
Oh, wow.
I used to play Little League Baseball, and we would go down to Bad Hersfeld. We would go to Fulda. I mean, I never saw the border. And so that's one reason in doing this research, I really wanted to see those border points. The only time I saw anything that resembled, a border crossing was when I took the duty train after the wall went up. My sister and I took the duty train to West Berlin from West Germany. And to take the duty train, you obviously have to cross the border. And we crossed the border in Helmstedt, and we were put on a train. My father took us up. We had very close German friends in Berlin, so my sister and I were going to visit with my parents' friends. And it was right after the wall. It was the winter after the wall went up. My mother had taken the duty train earlier in the summer, a week before the wall went up. And there's a photo in the book of her and her friends at the Brandenburg Gate before the wall was there. And then 6 months later, there are pictures that I took as a 10, 12-year old of the wall in the winter and some of the incidents that occurred when we took that trip. But crossing the border was pretty frightening because you weren't allowed to. The curtains were drawn very tightly. You were instructed not to look out at all
Hmm.
on the train. And at one point, it stopped in the middle of the night. We got on at about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, and it went very slowly. And I have to confess, I peeked through the curtain when it stopped, and I saw all the Russian soldiers along the side of the train. They came on for some reason, and then it went on. It proceeded, but they had the fur hats, and it was quite exciting as a kid. I thought it was quite a kick, but it was also a little frightening. So.
I'll bet I can certainly understand that. Yeah, now that you mention it, I'm realizing that you were there even before the wall went up. So was there like a noticeable change in the tensions in your area once the wall went up, even though you were not in Berlin at the time?
Oh yeah, there was a lot of it was tense from then on, and
Hmm.
it's interesting that you asked about. In retrospect, I never actually saw the border near Kassel or anywhere else. I saw baseball fields for Little League. That was about it. But
Hmm.
no, it's interesting, but it was tense, and you could feel it. I mean, again, being a child, you're protected a bit from it. My parents were
Hmm.
probably very, very nervous, I'm sure. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine what that was like, because your father's got a very important job to do there, and they're accompanied tours. I mean, like, obviously they don't prevent people from bringing their families over, so but I guess he had to kind of weigh the priorities of his work against the potential danger for the family, and decided that, correctly decided that it was worth the time, because nothing happened to any of you, of course, and you were there for a very, very pivotal era in history.
no, it was absolutely, it was a very exciting time to be there. I'm glad, very grateful that he opted to bring us over, and it was an experience of a lifetime, and it continues to be important to me. Obviously with
Oh yeah,
this
I
book.
can tell.
So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's important to me, and I wasn't even there. I wasn't even alive at the period. So, but here I am. So, Michael, can you you mentioned a couple of the photos already? Can you kind of just describe a couple of the photos and the stories behind them? I mean, we don't have them in front of us, of course, but your book is primarily a photo book.
right.
So, can you talk about why you selected certain photos and what really was going on behind the scenes, so to speak?
Sure. Well, I had I approached it from three different angles, or a variety of angles. I had been to Berlin a number of times, both at that time in the 60s, and I've been back three or four times. And over the years, for example, I've taken pictures at the wall. And when I first went back to Berlin, I would say, 15 years ago, there was still a lot of wall there and a lot of graffiti on the wall. Anyway, the book is comprised of archival photos from family, photos that I took at various points. The trip to Germany 2 years ago, I did a lot of photography at the base. I did a lot of there are snippets, because the book has, I think, around 55 photos, and I also took a lot of photos at the borders. And so there's an image of a border sign that says you're approaching the border, and only military personnel are allowed to proceed. And that was from an actual point, a border checkpoint. I took pictures in various museums there's a picture at the Stasi Museum, which is a fascinating museum to go to in Berlin also. It's remarkably interesting. But I took some photos there. I I chanced upon a list of Stasi safe houses. That's a mouthful. And I photographed some of those. Not many of I don't think any of those photos actually made it of the safe houses, because they were apartment buildings, and I managed to get inside a couple of them. But there wasn't much you could photograph other than the hallway and the mailboxes and that sort of thing. So, but there are also pictures, some of the, well, as I mentioned, the tools of the trade. There are quite a few
Mhm.
pictures of those. There are pictures of their memorabilia. There's my mother's ticket on the duty train that is actually quite interesting. It's the original ticket that she had. I found in family archives. There are pictures of my dad at work with the other agents. There are photos of, I mean, it's a wide variety. It's more an atmospheric conglomeration of photos that tell a story, and that's what I was really looking for. I might also mention that I found the most incredible book designer, Netta Kowalczyk, and the Blow Up. She works with Blow Up Press, and who are the publishers of the book in Poland. And Poland is famous for its graphic artists and graphic design. And
Hmm.
she was just named one of the top 10 designers in Poland. And
Oh wow.
and quite frankly, she did a marvel. I told her I wanted a sense of mystery for the viewer, not to be told everything, that they would have to figure it out as they went through. And and it worked. I think it really does. Another really major discovery I made, and it was near the end of my research, and I was euphoric. I was visiting my mom, and I opened up one of the closets at her apartment, and lo and behold, I saw five slide trays. And I thought, I haven't, my dad took a lot of slides, and he was a photographer. And I pulled them down, and I thought, oh, it would be nice if there were some from Germany in that period. And sure enough, I found about 200,
Oh wow.
200 very vintage photos that he had taken. And what's fun in the book, uh, there were photos I took on my trip to Berlin in 1961, and my dad took a trip the following summer. He had a meeting in Berlin, and he took pictures at Checkpoint Charlie, and again all of the wall and all of the associated sites along the wall. And so the book juxtaposes those. And so some of them are mine when I was 12 and some are his. And his had been seriously deteriorated because nobody had paid any attention to the slides and the carousels. I had them all scanned, but I've left in the book, many of them are still in the state in which I found them, which gives a sense of history. And I was quite excited by that.
Yeah, there it is wonderful, and just like you said, it is very, very atmospheric book, and it does leave a lot of questions to the reader. But that entire period is one thing I have certainly taken away from the past couple of years of research. So I really appreciated it for that. It is unlike any book that I've read and or completed for the podcast in the past because it is primarily photos. But I loved it honestly. It was very fascinating, and there was some terrific additional stuff like the one-time pad ciphers that you mentioned thrown in there,
Right.
and just a very, very enjoyable book.
Well, thank you, Justin. I appreciate
So
that.
absolutely. Michael, do you feel after you've completed this project, do you feel like you know your father a little bit better now?
Oh, absolutely. It's been, and I think he's smiling down at me, very proud, I'm sure, because to honor him in a way, I'm very, very happy to honor his service and what he did for the country. So it's a good feeling, and I feel like I've gotten some closure around this issue. So
That's good.
yeah.
That's good. Did he, after he retired, with your later conversations, did he open up at all more about it, or not really?
Oh yeah. I mean, some of the anecdotes that he told are things that I put in the book. He opened up a number. He would talk. He never went into any detail. Occasionally, he would tell a tale about. He said one time he was investigating an airman who they suspected of espionage, and he said that this guy was not the brightest bulb, and he would show up for meetings with his handler, and he'd be in his jacket, his Air Force jacket, with the name of his division on the back, and and it
Oh
was
my
it
goodness!
was it wasn't very high class espionage. So
Wow. I wonder. I have to wonder if his East German handler was like, "Oh my gosh, what is this guy doing? He's going to get us arrested," something like
exactly.
that. Wow.
And
Amazing. That's fascinating, and I'm very glad that you were able to get some closure there. It's unfortunate that there weren't more records, like you said, that would have shined further light. I wonder if there's something that's misfiled somewhere, or something like that. That will ultimately never see the light of day if a FOIA won't uncover it.
no, I've thought about writing again and trying to maybe get someone who's a little more uh, loose about things, but then I thought, I've learned enough. I feel comfortable about what I've done and what
Yeah,
I've learned. So
I
um,
understand. I understand
yeah.
totally.
So
Fantastic. So, Michael, when is the book out? Is it out now? Early October 2023? Is it already published?
it is. It's funny you ask. I'm going to Warsaw on Tuesday to sign 700 copies. It will be out at the end of this week. Um, the,
Into this week. Okay, great.
so
Okay, well, yeah, this episode is going to be debuting on the 9th of October. So it's already out by the 9th then, is that right?
definitely it will be out by the 9th.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
great, great. Great.
And
Okay, so for everybody listening, it's The Need to Know by Michael Honegger, and it is available now as you're listening to this episode.
and you can get can I mention the website just to?
Of course.
Yeah, you can purchase it directly from the publisher at Blow Up Press, all run together. Blow Up as in the film blowuppress.eu. You'll see the Need to Know. It's prominently displayed.
Great.
So
Okay. Yeah, I'll share that link once the episode is out and once I mention this on my social channels as well. So that'll make it easy for everybody who wants to find it.
Great. And you can also get it by the link on my website. So at
Okay.
michaelhoneggerphotos.com.
Okay.
Great.
michaelhoneggerphotos.com.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. So, Michael, now that this is out and after you finished autographing and everything, what are you going to be working on next? Do you have another project in mind already?
Well, yeah, I'm at the stage. I'm working on street photography here, and I live in Nice, France. I'm doing a lot of street photography of late and trying something just totally different. But I'm always eager to hear of new projects that interest me. So the street photography is keeping me busy and excited. But if something else comes along, I'm easily distracted. So,
Oh boy, yeah, I certainly know that feeling. There's always another story to read into, and that's honestly my favorite part about it. Not even the talking about it part, but the initial dive into a story and kind of uncovering something that's new to me, and if not new to the world at least. But that is a lot of fun to find something new and really get down deep into it.
exactly, exactly. So
Great. So, are you on any of the social media sites? Anything profiles you can share if people want to connect with you
I'm on,
besides at your website?
yeah, I'm on Instagram at Michael Honegger Photos, and you'll see a lot of pictures from the book. Facebook, Michael Honegger Photos.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate the chat, Michael, and the book was wonderful, like I mentioned. So I'm glad to see you're getting it out there and getting your father's story, at least a fraction of it, out there a little bit more for people who are interested.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Justin. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, Michael. Take care.
You too. Bye bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.